It looks very apocalyptic. We're talking patches of brown dirt, buildings that have crumbled, whole areas where you can still see that there were roads there, that there were little neighborhood blocks, but nothing there anymore. And then these tiny white tents flapping in the wind. I mean, this is what Gaza looks like now.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
This week we're looking at the latest in the Middle East, including the biggest Israeli military operation in the West Bank since the Second Intifada and Hezbollah's rocket attack against Israel. We also take a trip into the skies above Gaza with one of our reporters for a rare bird's-eye glimpse into the territory. Plus, an al-Qaeda-linked group has been accused of murdering hundreds of people in Burkina Faso. We discuss jihadists and the security situation in the Sahel region. It's Friday, August 30th, 2024. We begin in Israel, where tensions in the West Bank are on the brink of erupting into an all-out conflict. After months of small-scale raids, settler violence and clashes, the Israeli military has launched a major operation in the occupied Palestinian territory. I caught up with our senior foreign correspondent Sophia Yan to find out what's been happening this week.
What Israel is doing now in the West Bank is considered its largest offensive in many, many, many years. It's happening as tensions from the war in Gaza spill over. It started overnight into Wednesday this week, and it's expected to continue for the next several days. It might continue beyond that. We don't know. So far, at least 10 Palestinians have been killed. Now, that's according to Palestinian health officials. On the whole, since war broke out October 7th of last year, some estimates put the total death count in the West Bank alone at more than 600 Palestinians. Israel has said that in this operation, they've succeeded in killing some combatants, including a senior commander for Islamic Jihad. That's a Palestinian militant group that shares the same goal as Hamas. And what makes this attack so far very, very significant is that the IDF is targeting many locations simultaneously in the northern part of the West Bank. So in some ways, this mirrors the Gaza operation. If you remember, last October, the Israeli military first went into North Gaza to try to snuff out Hamas, and eventually the IDF was able to slice the Gaza Strip into two sections, north and south. And that operation in Gaza, of course, still ongoing.
Why is this happening now? What's Israel's objective here?
Well, what Israel is trying to do in the West Bank is what it has been trying to do in Gaza all along, and that is to reach its goal to obliterate Hamas, to completely take out this group. Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups do also operate from the West Bank. So in some respects, this move by the Israelis was expected. It was perhaps a matter of time before they went into the West Bank like this. And it's worth noting that this isn't the first time they've gone into the West Bank. Since October 7th, there have been smaller raids. Again, what's different this time is the scale by which the Israeli military is operating at.
You mentioned Hamas and Islamic Jihad. How widespread are these Islamist groups in the West Bank? We don't hear about them as much, do we?
Well, Israel, from their perspective, these groups have fighters that are embedded inside the cities of the West Bank. And that's why Israel is going after a lot of these spots simultaneously, again, in the northern part of the West Bank. One of these cities is Jenin. And I want to highlight that this city, the city of Jenin, has long been a flashpoint. This is an area that has seen over the years some of the worst violence in the West Bank. You mentioned before the Second Intifada, this was a period from 2000 to 2005 when there were very serious clashes between the Palestinians and the Israelis. All this was sparked at the time after peace talks broke down. And again, some of the worst fighting, some of the worst clashes were in Jenin. There's also a refugee camp there. This is some of the poorest areas of the West Bank. And so Israel says that there are fighters that are embedded in these camps. The fear, as it is in Gaza, is that the civilian death toll could be staggering because these fighters, as Israel sees them, are in areas where regular people are trying to live their lives. I just wanted to highlight an additional issue in the West Bank that you don't see as much in Gaza is that there are clashes that have been happening locally. Israelis who have purposefully moved to the West Bank, they see it as their right to do so. They've attacked Palestinians. We've seen a lot of Israeli settler violence, and that itself has drawn scrutiny and sanctions from the U.S. So there are many layers of risk here and of fighting going on in the West Bank.
Yeah, there is a real danger of this I guess, escalating significantly. The West Bank is often described as a tinderbox. Israel has a lot more control over what goes on inside the West Bank than it does in Gaza. West Bank is divided into 3 areas that have sort of cascading grades of Israeli military control. We've seen a warning today from the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, that Israel must not extend the war in Gaza to the West Bank. Do you think that's what we're likely to see?
Well, I just want to highlight again that Israel has said all this time that their goal is to completely snuff out Hamas. This is, in some respects, very difficult to do because there's a question, well, what is Hamas? How do they define that? Are they going to define that once they take out all the top commanders? Will they define it if they kill every known combatant that they can find? Some say Hamas is an ideology, that it can't actually be obliterated. So this is a big question. And from Israel's perspective, you have to remember that even now, nearly 11 months into war, their sense of security was completely shattered after October 7th. What they thought could never happen, which was this massive attack, something that they had spent all this time preparing for and defending against, something they thought could never happen did happen. And so now there's a big fear and a push to try to prevent that from happening again. And so it's possible that things continue to escalate in the West Bank because it is known that Hamas and Islamic Jihad, these other armed groups, are operating from the West Bank.
Just lastly, on the West Bank, I know radicalisation is something that we've spoken about before here on Battle Lines. Is there a risk of that occurring in the West Bank?
For anyone who's living through this war, you're seeing a lot of death and destruction. It's not a surprise that this will have very traumatic impacts on minors, on children, on teenagers, even adults. 10 years ago in Gaza, there was also a period of violence in 2014. And some of those children then, in their early teens, are adults now. That's about the same age of the militants that streamed across the border from Gaza into Israel last October. Right now, we're in the middle of all of this fighting. It's hard to predict the future, actually impossible. Of course, violence, as we've seen in this conflict, often begets violence. It's hard to see how the cycle stops, and negotiations that are ongoing for a ceasefire haven't really gone anywhere. We can speak about that more later in the podcast, but right now we're sort of in this pattern where one act of violence is responded to with another act of violence, and it has continued like this back and forth. We've seen that already in these last 10 to 11 months of this particular war. And again, it's hard to see how we come out of this on the other side.
So let's talk about Gaza now. What's been happening there this week?
There is still brutal fighting ongoing throughout Gaza. Israel has recovered some hostages. There's one man, Qaid Farhad al-Qadi. He was rescued alive, and he himself is now calling for a ceasefire deal. There was also another person, a soldier, thought to have died on October 7th when war broke out. That body also found. There are still 108 hostages remaining in Gaza. About a third of these are believed to be dead. The fate of the others are unknown. The death toll, now more than 40,000 Palestinians killed. That's a staggering fraction. Gaza has a population of about 2 million people. And the humanitarian crisis is very dire. This is something that many aid organizations have raised. There's a lack of food and clean water and medicine. Cases of polio now cropping up. Famine is very widespread. And aside from direct injuries, meaning deaths linked to war and actual fighting, there's a huge challenge when it comes to secondary issues, secondary deaths. People, for instance, who are dying from starvation or because they can't get life-saving medicine.
You mentioned polio. We've had a 10-month-old baby, the first confirmed case in Gaza in 25 years. Have you heard anything more about whether there might be a pause in hostilities to allow a vaccination campaign to get underway?
Well, this is one of the many issues that's on the table. Negotiations for a ceasefire ongoing, primarily taking place in Doha. But there's a lot that these two sides just can't agree on. Even on a starting point, they're not able to see eye to eye. So this is one of the biggest problems. It doesn't help that, if you remember, right at the end of July, Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the senior political leader with Hamas, who was the chief negotiator on these talks. And that assassination happened while he was in Iran. So we're also holding our breath. The world is holding its breath in anticipation of a response from Iran, which supports Hamas. Iran's still widely expected to retaliate against Iran for this attack. The question is when and how.
And there's a US political element to these ceasefire talks as well, isn't there? Obviously, the US is the main mediator. You've mentioned others, Qatar and Egypt, but it's the US that really has the leverage over Israel, for example. How has that played out, and how do we think the upcoming election will affect the dynamics of ceasefire negotiations?
The U.S. has sent a number of senior officials for these talks. They've sent them at different levels, from the White House, from the State Department, all trying to find some sort of common ground. But again, the U.S. is now very deep into an election cycle. We're about 2 months out until the presidential elections. And with that in mind, the U.S., their attention span is directed toward that. Foreign policy has to continue for the U.S., but it's hard to say. It depends on who takes that role in the U.S. as president, who will be in the White House in a couple of months' time. Once the election happens, the inauguration happens, the presidential transition occurs, what will that mean for what happens next? The candidates have both talked a little bit about this. I'll leave that for the U.S. reporters to discuss in more detail. But to a certain extent, for both parties, support for Israel is not likely to wane. This is something that the U.S. has for many years made very clear. And the overarching worry is, if the U.S. weren't involved in the Middle East, could things be much, much worse?
And then just finally in Gaza, we've seen today that the UN Food Agency, the WFP, World Food Programme, has suspended operations in Gaza after one of its cars was hit at an Israeli checkpoint. Can you tell us anything more about that?
So fighting in Gaza and the Israeli blockade poses a huge challenge to get enough supplies in for people in Gaza itself. Aid convoys have been attacked, and this latest that you mentioned from the World Food Programme, saying that they are stopping movement of its staff, quote, until further notice. This happened after one of its vehicles was struck by gunfire at an Israeli military checkpoint. And this really is a problem, because we're talking about all these people in Gaza who need food, who need medicine, who need supplies just to survive. There's not enough getting in. And again, this is all subject to what Israel approves and allows to come in. So we're talking about a dire humanitarian crisis, a population, many of whom have been displaced, no longer able to live in their homes because those homes were destroyed, and people who need some means to continue on for the next few hours and the next few days.
We've spoken about it before on Battle Lines, but it's such a tricky, and it has been and continues to be a tricky conflict to report on because, of course, international reporters are not allowed in. And as much as we can work with reporters on the ground in Gaza, it's dangerous work for them. And we need to be able to see things with our own eyes sometimes to provide that impartiality that international media like to think that they bring to foreign conflicts. But one of the ways that we can get eyes on the situation is from the air. And that's exactly what you did recently. You took a trip on board a C-130 military transport plane with the Jordanian Air Force to fly over Gaza for an aid drop. Let's hear a bit of your dispatch from the plane.
They've now opened the back of the plane. Now we're nearing the strip itself on the southern side. We can now see the strip. There goes the first drop. You can see the destruction in the Gaza Strip from the plane.
So we heard a bit of your audio there from your dispatch. Can you tell us a bit more about what you saw and the insights it gave you into the conflict in Gaza?
I went with the Jordan Air Force on a humanitarian aid mission to drop food rations over southern Gaza. Now, the Jordan Air Force is doing this periodically because of the extreme lack of supplies. But again, this happens only with the approval of Israeli authorities. It's key to note that what goes in and out of Gaza by air or on land, it has to be with express permission of the Israelis. So this was a one-day mission. And because Gaza itself is so small, the actual flying time that we had over the Strip was only a few minutes in the end. But even in just those few minutes over southern Gaza, I could see so much destruction on the ground. We flew about 2,000 feet over Gaza. So it's close enough that I could see these buildings that were damaged. I could see, for instance, when we got to the southern part of Gaza, to the border to Egypt, it was a stark contrast. There were trees, super green in Egypt, and then on the Gaza side, just brown dirt, patches of brown dirt, just areas that had been completely bombed out. We got exclusive footage, and we did manage to identify what it used to be, and then interviewed people who lived there or remembered what those neighborhoods used to be like. One thing that I saw and identified with this footage is that along the coast, there are a number of recreational facilities, like football fields and beach resorts that are gone. They were possibly bulldozed by the Israelis, and it does suggest that maybe Israel is creating a buffer zone also along the coast. This has been something that Israel has been doing already on other parts of the border to Gaza, along the north and the east, which borders Israel, and then on the south to Egypt. And the idea is to prevent another attack as what happened on October 7th, to try to create more of a militarized zone along this part so that it makes it much harder for those in Gaza to get outside of Gaza into Israel.
And your story also mentioned greenhouses and orchards. Tell us a bit about what you saw for those.
So I found a lot of arable land. I found greenhouses also destroyed and damaged. This is interesting because there is, as part of the current discussions about a ceasefire, there's a big question of what happens to Gaza once the fighting stops. What happens to the people who are living there? What happens to the administrative authority who takes control over Gaza? And what happens to people there? What happens to their ability to be able to provide for themselves? So there's a huge concern that a lot of rights groups have raised, which is linked to this issue of agriculture and greenhouses. A lot of these destroyed in the war. And without that, this really throws into question what the food security situation is like in Gaza after the fighting stops. How will people living in Gaza grow food for themselves and provide for themselves? This is a big question. All of this will have to be rebuilt if we get to that day. 60% of buildings in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged. This is according to satellite image analysis by researchers in the US, and this matches what I also saw on this aid flight. Entire neighborhoods flattened. When we were first flying over Gaza, I noticed a lot of white dots, and after a few seconds I realized that these were all tents, that these were people without homes, people who've been displaced. And it's very shocking. I almost can't find the right words to describe this. I mean, it looks very apocalyptic. We're talking patches of brown dirt, buildings that have crumbled, whole areas where you can still see that there were roads there, that there were little neighborhood blocks, but nothing there anymore. And then these tiny white tents flapping in the wind. I mean, this is what Gaza looks like now. And it's very sad to see. You know, many of these are regular people, civilians who are just trying to survive. A lot of mosques have been destroyed, including ones that were funded internationally. I found one mosque that was built with donations from a Muslim group in Malaysia that was destroyed on the first day of war. The discovery of a building that I found possibly most harrowing was a wedding venue, actually. It had been partially damaged, and I found their Facebook page. They used to post congratulatory messages to all the grooms on the day of their wedding celebrations. And the last groom they congratulated was on October 6th. And the last post this particular wedding venue managed was to send well wishes for everyone. And that's it. That's the last that they were able to put online.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Finally, we should discuss Hezbollah's retaliation against Israel for the alleged assassination of one of its senior commanders. There were a lot of competing statements about how much damage Hezbollah actually did with their rocket attack last weekend. What do we know now?
Yes, this was a massive exchange of fire between Israel and Hezbollah. Both sides made very big claims, as you mentioned. Hezbollah said it hit an Israeli military intelligence site near Tel Aviv by sending hundreds of rockets and drones. Israel said it launched dozens of strikes to preempt what would have been a larger attack. Now, neither side have given concrete evidence of this. Israel has denied that Hezbollah hit any military site. Now, if that happened, would Israel confirm? This is a question mark. How much damage Hezbollah has sustained too? Also a question mark. Would they actually admit to it? This is something that in the fog of war, it's part of the calculation in the strategy. How much do you actually say? One takeaway is that both sides have signaled, at least for now, the worst is possibly over. Even Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, he said himself very clearly, quote, "We will now reserve the right to respond at a later time. At this current stage, the country can take a breath and relax." So for now, possibly a holding pattern.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. Sophia Yan, our senior foreign correspondent in Istanbul. Now to Burkina Faso, where more than 200 people have been killed in what has been described as potentially the country's worst ever terrorist attack. I spoke to our Africa correspondent, Ben Farmer, to find out more. Welcome to Battle Lines, Ben. Why don't you start by walking us through what happened in Burkina Faso last week and the significance of the attack?
Yes, well, at the weekend we saw a terrible massacre of civilians and security forces in central Burkina Faso. Al-Qaeda-led militants took responsibility for it, and it's thought to have killed as many as 300 people. What seems to have happened is that civilians and security forces were digging trenches to fortify the area when the attack happened. Villagers complained that the military forced them to work and they had no choice. Videos purporting to show the attack show gunmen opening fire and scores of dead bodies lying in and around the trenches. There hasn't been an official death toll, but estimates by analysts say that it could be 300 or more. Now, the significance of this is it once again shows the terrible state of security that there is in the country. The government is estimated to control somewhere around only 40 or 50% of its territory. The rest is in the hands of various jihadist groups. And this is the latest in a long line of attacks. As recently as June, the same armed group as responsible for the most recent attack claimed another attack where it was thought to have killed 100 soldiers.
And who do we think was behind the attack?
Well, there is a patchwork of jihadist groups which is operating not just in Burkina Faso, but across the Sahel region, in neighbouring Niger and Mali as well. This main group that carried out the attack is linked to Al-Qaeda, and they've been waging this insurgency for over a decade.
And they're called the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, Jamaat Nusra al-Islam wal al-Muslimin. JNIM or JNIM?
JNIM, yes, that's the acronym they go by. And that is the main group which has been conducting these attacks. But as I say, there are other groups. And in fact, one of the other groups, which is active in the area, is the local branch of Islamic State Group. Islamic State Group has focused its attentions on Africa after its own caliphate in the Middle East was destroyed in 2019.
And how much support do these groups have? I mean, it's headline-grabbing stuff, obviously, when jihadist groups, particularly with names that we recognise in the West, like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, conduct attacks. Do they have a lot of support on the ground in Burkina Faso? How widespread is their presence and how strong are they?
I think, like many of these situations, the local population is caught in the middle. The militants are not necessarily always that popular, and they are very brutal. But the military are also unpopular, and as they wage war on these Al-Qaeda groups, they often conduct atrocities against the civilian population, which can turn the civilians against the military and drive them to the militant groups. So they do have some support, but I think the civilians are largely caught in the middle.
And the leader of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, he actually came to power promising to defeat jihadist groups. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. As we've seen these groups grow in strength across the Sahel, then Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso have all had military coups. They've been power grabs by the military leadership, who have all said that they will bring security and fight the jihadists. But as we've seen, they've had very mixed results in that.
So why don't we talk about the sort of broader picture in the Sahel? You mentioned Mali, that's the country neighbouring Burkina Faso, and they've got a huge presence of jihadist groups. What's the sort of relationship between these jihadist groups spread across the Sahel region?
Well, neither of those countries can fully control their border. So I think there is a lot of movement. And a lot of groups, there are some allied, they form alliances, and they do work together or support each other. So this is very much a cross-border problem.
And where are they getting their weapons, their funding from? Are there outside actors that we should be talking about who are helping to support these groups?
It's not totally clear where they're getting their funding from. In the past, groups like this have had support from donations, they've had support from seizing natural resources, they've had support, they get money from extortion. So in the past, similar groups have had lots of ways of getting money. It's not totally clear how these groups are getting their funding.
What about Wagner Group, the Russian-backed militia?
I think very much they are involved, and one of the plays they've made with all of these countries is they have offered their services to these military hunters, and they have said, we will fight the jihadists for you, or we will train your forces. And certainly they're working very closely with the government in Mali, and they're also providing military advisors in Burkina Faso, in Niger. So that is very much a way that they are expanding their influence in this area.
And why would Wagner Group be present here? What's the gain for Russia?
I think that they want to dislodge European and foreign presence here. And to do that, they are offering their services and saying that we can succeed where perhaps French and the United Nations peacekeepers have failed.
The background to all of this, of course, is the French withdrawal of their peacekeeping forces last year. How has that changed the power dynamics and the security situation in the Sahel region?
Well, there was a groundswell of anti-French feeling across these three countries, and France and the UN have left. And not just them, that followed, the Americans have also left. They left their base in Niger earlier this month. So that really has left the local governments dealing with Russia as the main foreign power there. But as we've seen, the French may not have had much success in defeating these jihadists, but the local governments backed by the Wagner Group are also struggling.
And what kind of prospect for future conflict do you think you see in this region? Are we expecting Western forces to sweep back in, or will it be a sort of continuing slide into lawlessness? Is there a way for countries to deal with these situations themselves?
Analysts you talk to about this are very bleak about their forecasts. They do see it getting worse. And I think certainly the way things are at the moment, there is no appetite for the West to go back in, particularly if there was no invitation from the local governments. And at this point, it doesn't look like they are willing for the Western forces to enter at all.
And finally, when we talk about jihadist groups in the Middle East, obviously they have spawned terror attacks in Europe and in America. Is there a potential for something similar to happen from jihadist groups based in the Sahel, for that conflict to spread elsewhere?
Analysts do warn that wherever these groups do have a stronghold, there is always the potential for them to influence people back in Europe. Now, it may be very difficult for them to send jihadists from these places in Africa or for people to come and train. But certainly they have the potential to spread propaganda. And as long as there are strongholds where these groups are still able to operate and do still seem to have a measure of success, then that does encourage and embolden groups elsewhere, potentially in Europe.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us. It's Ben Farmer in South Africa.
Thanks, Venetia.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.